The first talk is going to be given by Robert Konrad, who is a PhD student at Stanford working on virtual reality displays and cameras. His talk is going to be focused on SpinVR, a live streaming 3D virtual reality video platform.
So today I'll be talking about SpinVR, a platform we built towards live streaming 3D virtual reality video. So one of the coolest applications I heard of when I started working in the space of VR and AR a couple of years ago now was this live streaming application of VR systems. I mean, imagine putting a live streaming camera in the NBA final courtside seats and just being able to stream that to all the viewers at home. You wouldn't have to pay thousands of dollars to sit in these premium seats. You could just watch it in your pajamas on your couch. Of course, there are more interesting or other industrial applications, such as telepresence surgery or exploring areas of the world that we're not, as humans, capable of going to and controlling them by being able to see the world around us using these live streaming videos. So today, I'm going to be showing you how to capture live streamed videos like this one. Don't be fooled, this is actually a 3D video, but because I'm constrained to a 2D screen, I can only show you a 2D projection. If you were to view this on YouTube with a VR headset, you'd be able to get the full stereo information for any head rotation. And I'll have this link up throughout the slides, so you can hopefully go to this YouTube page later and convince yourself that this is the case. So why is capturing data like this difficult? Well, the reason is that we can currently only do this with camera arrays like the ones you see here. Facebook, Google, GoPro, and others have all followed this type of design where you have the general principle of operation is to capture the scene using a bunch of outward-facing cameras and then process them to make it viewable, make the content viewable on a headset. And the processing that you typically try to do is some sort of view interpolation so that you can see the views in between the cameras. And when I mean they have to process the data, I really mean it. These cameras capture tens of gigabits of data a second, firstly making the data offlink non-trivial. They require some sort of optical offlinks into an SSD RAID array to make this work. But it also means that they have to process a lot of data. The compute on many of these rigs take about 10 seconds to render out a single frame, and that's even when it's run on a data center. So this isn't entirely a live streaming application just yet. You can capture the video in real time, but then you have to wait maybe a couple of days to actually be able to view it on a headset. That said, there are live streaming cameras. They do exist, but they typically sacrifice field of view or really heavily rely on calibration to constrain this view interpolation problem to speed it up. So calibration is fine, but it tends to break and tends to drift over time, so it requires recalibration of the system continuously. And if you have a miscalibrated system, you can start seeing artifacts like in this one. And this is a still from a video that NASA captured of a rocket launch, which is pretty cool. But what's not cool are these artifacts that you end up seeing near these poles here. And we like to joke that this is a hard problem because rocket scientists still can't get it quite right. But all jokes aside, even if the calibration is actually correct and perfect, you still see certain artifacts due to these optical flow-based interpolation methods. So anywhere essentially where optical flow has challenges, you start seeing these artifacts show up in the output videos that you start seeing, that you want to see on these VR headsets. So these systems typically have troubles with transparencies or reflections or occlusions and flow mismatches like you see here. They also tend to lose fine structures, or if objects are too close, you lose a gorilla's face. And each of these artifacts are actually taken straight out of the Anderson et al. Paper, which describes the Google Jump system that was presented at SIGGRAPH Asia in 2016. And it has a very nice design overview, or design space overview of current camera array-based systems. But to understand what we're trying to attempt in our system for a live streaming platform, we're going to go back to omnidirectional stereo, which is actually the format that all of these cameras try to boil the data down to. So omnidirectional stereo is a data format for storing omnidirectional stereo video. It uses a pair of multi-perspective panoramic images to encode all of the viewing directions for the two eyes, like you see here. Now, you might be curious, how would you represent a pair of views in every direction in a panorama? I mean, ideally, what you'd have is a full 2D perspective of the scene at every head rotation. And you can store all this data, but it's kind of hard. You have to store a lot of data for every head rotation and allow that for all head rotations. So to approximate this, omnidirectional stereo was developed, and that's exactly what it is, an approximation to this kind of this full frame projection. So omnidirectional stereo instead just captures the tangential rays to a certain viewing circle, essentially your head rotation circle. And technically, this isn't entirely accurate. You're not getting the correct rays at every single head rotation, but locally, the errors are almost imperceivable. And that's because this error is essentially smoothed out over the field of view, and you actually really can't notice them except at the viewing extremes and in your periphery. So again, Anderson et al. Has a nice evaluation of these artifacts, but I'm going to leave that for his paper. I encourage you to read it. But how do you capture this type of omnidirectional stereo format? I already showed you that these camera array rigs try to boil it down using view interpolation and these optical flow methods. But actually, the original papers by Peleg and Ishiguro, they proposed just rotating a camera around some nodal point and just taking out certain columns of the data on the sensor. You can equivalently do this by actually rotating 2 line cameras, and actually at every single exposure, each camera just plops in its data into a panorama that you just keep filling in. And after a complete rotation after one rotation, the full frame of a full frame of the video is complete. And this is what you'd end up showing to a viewer on a VR headset. You would just crop out a certain region and present certain regions to the viewer when they end up viewing this scene. So we took inspiration from this kind of rotating idea back presented initially in the first papers on in this area. And we created SpinVR, which is essentially a very fast spinning version of that initial idea. We use 2 line scan cameras that have a resolution of 4096 by 2. And the reason we use these line scan cameras is that they can expose really, really quickly. They have a refresh rate of 13 kilohertz. So like I said, one full rotation of this camera corresponds to 1 frame of the video, but during that rotation, we have to expose the camera thousands of times. So a quick refresh rate is very, very important. We put 2 fisheye lenses, or a fisheye lens in front of each camera that has a 175-degree field of view, which allows us to capture essentially a very large part of the scene that we want. These 2 things are mounted on a rotary stage, which allows all of this to rotate. That is then driven by a servo motor that can drive rotations up to 1,000 RPM. To allow the cables to not get tangled, we mount this all on a slip ring to allow essentially continuous connection to the cameras and power them. So let's compare this kind of processing pipeline of this sort of camera to traditional array-based systems. So in the array-based systems, we first capture the data and store it, and then we perform some simple image processing, demosaicing, color calibration, et cetera. And then come the really compute-heavy things. We have to perform an optical flow computation pairwise between each set of cameras. And then we perform some view synthesis and finally composite that all into this ODS format. In contrast, our system, essentially, we capture the data, we demosaic it, and again, do some simple image processing, demosaicing, image color balancing, et cetera. But we essentially capture the exact rays of light that we need to put into the ODS at the end. We don't have any additional processing that slow down this whole pipeline. So this gives us a couple of things. We have minimal capture bandwidth. We essentially are very efficient because we only capture the rays of light that we need. We have minimal compute, and this is beneficial because, 1, it solves this artifact issue. We don't have any kind of hallucinations of data. We don't have any of these problems that current array-based systems have because of this. And we don't require calibration to achieve live streaming. But this introduces some new challenges that I'll talk about right now, as well as a new design space that we have to work within. So the first challenge that we encountered was we saw seams in our output frames, kind of like the one you see here. And if you think about it, it's actually pretty obvious as to why that is. We essentially implemented a big rolling shutter with this continuously rotating camera. So we have a temporal discontinuity between the beginning and end of the frame, this gray region that we wanted to end up displaying. The good news is that we still actually have the biker's left half. He's just in the previous frame, in this red arc here. So we can actually just fill him in by taking that data from the previous frame. We're continuously rotating this camera. We have that information. So if you create a viewer that keeps buffering the previous frame, we can always have a seamless rendering technique, and this is viewer independent, meaning that this is on the viewer side, so multiple viewers can see a seamless viewing experience. So another effect that we saw that actually is interestingly enough isn't specific to our system but to the ODS format as a whole is warping near the poles. So this is due to the vertical extents of the imagery following the trajectory of the cameras, this circle at the top here. And what it ends up showing up in the images as is this kind of warping right here near the pole of the camera. And this distortion is rotation invariant and can be modeled using these two equations. And the correction for this distortion is actually quite simple. You can either do it using two 1D interpolations or a single 2D interpolation, and it can be done very much in real time. So the extent of this distortion is depth dependent, and we need to estimate two parameters. Essentially, this lowercase r, the height of the sphere, and the distance between the two cameras. This uppercase r, the distance between the two cameras, is fixed in the hardware design. So we only really have to estimate r, lowercase r. Luckily, because the scene, for the most part, doesn't change, the sky doesn't get any further or closer away when we capture a scene, and the ceiling typically stays put, we can estimate this R relatively easily, and once we have an estimate on these two parameters, we can de-warp an image like this one to correct for this warp. So another thing that we analyzed is the design space trade-off. So one thing, hopefully, that you noticed when I was explaining to you how the system works is you should be concerned about the light levels that we get, how many photons we're actually getting on the sensor. I said that a single rotation is necessary to complete one frame. Ideally, we do that 30 times or 60 times or 120 times a second. On top of that, we're exposing the camera thousands of times during each rotation. So the exposure time for each individual exposure time of the camera is very, very short. So we had to analyze this. We had a couple of parameters that we could play with. We could play with the frame rate, we could play with the horizontal resolution, and the number of sensors per eye. And we saw that actually when we operate outside in sunny days, we see that one sensor per eye allows us to achieve excellent quality for many different configurations. And this excellent quality is based on SNR, essentially how much light we're getting, based on work by Oli Kosard. But when we move indoors and have less light at our disposal, we start seeing that we need to either add more sensors per eye, add more cameras, or start having some trade-offs in terms of horizontal resolution and the frame rate that we can achieve. And you can look in the paper to see a more detailed description of these trade-offs. So keeping all of these design trade-offs and these challenges in mind, we actually ended up building a physical prototype that implements this idea. You can see it spinning up here. On the right side, you can see it in an acrylic tube because when it spins up to much higher rates, it's not super comfortable to be standing next to. So for the safety of ourselves and others, we place an acrylic tube around it just in case anything were to go wrong. One thing I should mention is that the slip ring, this gold cylinder you see here, is actually currently limiting our FPS to only 5. And the reason for that is that the signal integrity through the slip ring deteriorates at the higher rotation speeds, and we actually can't get data off of the cameras at higher frame rates. So we can spin the thing faster, but we just can't get any data off of it. However, even with this limitation, we're able to capture videos like this one of me with an overgrown beard after a SIGGRAPH deadline. So what you can see here is video captured with our system. Again, this is just a 2D view of the ODS format that we're directly streaming into. If you were to view this on YouTube, you'd have the full stereo information at any head rotation. And again, this was shot you can see all the resolutions that we support with our video. We captured a couple different scenes at different frame rates just to look at the kind of effects of frame rate and exposure time of the cameras. But to have a slightly more empirical evaluation, we captured the same scene at different frame rates to see whether our design analysis, that the simulations that we performed, actually kind of hold up. So we took an image of an indoor scene of our office at 1/26th FPS, right? So it's pretty slow. This pretty much only works for static scenes. When we increase the frame rate to 1 or 16 FPS, you see that the images get extremely grainy, and the image quality drops off very quickly. However, if we capture an outdoor scene with the same frame rates, we see that actually the image quality is just fine regardless of the frame rate. So for outdoor scenes, we can still get excellent quality images using our system here. So hopefully, if you were paying attention, you'll see that Here I'm claiming that we captured this at 16 FPS, but I just told you that we can only capture at 5. And the reason is that we didn't actually spin the thing at 16 FPS. We just exposed as if we were going to spin it at 16 FPS. So this is still an accurate simulation of what the camera would see if we were actually rotating it or capturing at this frame rate. To prove to you that we can actually do live capture, we had Hayato, a colleague of mine, juggle some mandarins in front of our spinning display. And you can see here a zoomed-in portion of the ODS panorama of him juggling. So this is shot at 5 frames a second. And we can see that he's well, actually, I think this is less than 5 frames a second. But you can see that in real time, this is the full processing pipeline. We can have live streaming using our system. We also captured a couple of challenging scenes with our system. We took objects very close and compared it to an algorithm that uses this optical flow-based method. So with our system, we have no optical or no distortions, while these optical flow-based methods start seeing distortions when objects get very close. We also captured a bunch of challenging scenes that have reflections and transparencies and occlusions and fine structures, and see that our camera actually recreates all of these effects very accurately. And the reason is we're capturing exactly the light rays that we will end up displaying. Whatever the camera sees, which sees the correct effects, we end up just displaying that in the panorama. We don't have any errors due to this algorithmic problems. So moving on to future directions, we'd like to be inspired, take inspiration from the LiDAR community and think that we can make this system smaller and more affordable. We can get smaller cameras ideally, and then with smaller cameras come smaller lenses. Maybe we can put more of these cameras on there to expand this design space a little bit more. We'd also like to use an optical offlink to avoid the slip ring that's limiting our FPS currently, and maybe look at alternative optics, such as the ones presented by Agarwal in CVPR 2016, that uses these interesting fisheye lenses, or not fisheye, coffee filter lenses, coffee filter mirrors, to capture omnidirectional stereo panorama with a single shot and still only capture the rays of light needed. So with that, I'd like to conclude and just today we presented, or I presented, an omnidirectional stereo capture system that can stream live data. It has low computational cost allowing for this, and it actually is robust to all of these common artifacts that common camera array-based systems have. I presented to you some seamless rendering techniques, the dewarping at the poles and SNR analysis, but in the paper you'll find a couple other things I didn't have time to talk about today, specifically non-uniform sampling. We can have some interesting design challenges there, as well as a more intricate hardware design description. So with that, I'd like to conclude and take any questions.